Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Navigating the Cybersecurity Landscape, Unlocking Basics for Beginners. I'm Rinal Vikaria, and I'll be your host for the day. Before we get started, we would like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen-only mode and will last for an hour, out of which last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar, to organizers or a speaker, use the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio-video challenges, please check your internet connection or you may log out and log in again. Now about our speaker. Adam Jones is a freelance ethical hacker, cybersecurity educator, and web developer with 7+ years of experience. He focuses mostly on penetration testing of online assets, especially web apps, and holds the EC Council certified cybersecurity technician CCT qualification. Adam creates InfoSec video content, including walkthroughs of vulnerable labs and capture the flag CTF exercises under the online handle of Zenshell. As a professional full stack web developer, he has a strong understanding of core web technologies, including PHP and JavaScript. So without any further delay, I would now hand over the session to our speaker.
All right, what's up, guys? Thanks very much for that introduction. So I'm Adam, aka Zenshell, so that's my alias. You'll find me online, and I hold the certified cybersecurity technician cert from EC Council. And if you have any questions about the CCT, it will be possible for you to ask those questions at the end of the webinar today. And a lot of the content we'll discuss today, you'll find is expanded on in the CCT certification from EC Council. So as mentioned, I create educational content related to ethical hacking and web development. I'm interested in web development, and I'm also a bounty hunter. A little bit more on that a little bit later in the webinar. So let's start off with the cybersecurity landscape. You saw a couple of these statistics referenced in the video, and I'd like to give you my take on them, and also just to manage expectations somewhat. So 78,000 to 113,000 US dollars is the average salary for an entry-level cybersecurity job per year in the United States. 3.5 million job vacancies projected by 2025. 2.4x faster growth in employer demand for cybersecurity professionals than the overall rate across the US economy. So obviously that's great if you're in the US. Most of us are potentially not in the US, so more on that shortly. And 0% unemployment rate. Now let's just start by focusing on that average salary between 78 and 113,000 US dollars. If we were hoping, for example, just to maybe spend a few months getting some certs and then automatically get an entry-level job worth 113,000 US dollars, unfortunately, it's not always quite that simple. To give you an example, in my home country, the United Kingdom, the average salary for an entry-level cybersecurity job is a lot closer to about 30,000 US dollars. So it's clear that not everywhere, not every country values cybersecurity professionals to the same level as, let's say, in the US, for example. It may be worth, if you're interested in starting a career, to take a look at what kind of salaries you can expect in your area. Let's take a look at that 0% unemployment rate statistic. Now, what comes to mind when you think of 0% unemployment rate? To a normal person, they would think, well, that means that there's nobody in the industry that's unemployed, right? 0% unemployment. That's not really what that statistic means. What it really means is that there are so many vacancies that those vacancies vastly outnumber the amount of cybersecurity professionals looking for work in the industry. It doesn't mean that everyone has a job, and it doesn't mean that there aren't cybersecurity professionals looking for work in the industry. I'll give you an example of part of the problem. Those 3.5 million job vacancies projected by 2025, a decent amount of them may not be offering an appropriate salary for the type of role that they're advertising for. So you could conceivably have a cybersecurity professional looking for a job and then a company with a vacancy, but that vacancy could be offering half of what that specific job role should pay. So you have a cybersecurity professional, you have a vacancy, but those two are not going to meet because the criteria is not right. So do a bit of research in your area. Don't assume that you'll automatically get a high salary. But the good news is you should take something positive from this, and that is there are plenty of vacancies in the cybersecurity industry, and the average salary will likely be higher than other types of jobs available in your country. So generally, it's a good industry to get into. There's certainly a demand for more cybersecurity professionals. Now, why is there a need for more cybersecurity professionals? One of the reasons is that humans are very good at what we can refer to as proactive security. Now, we're going to contrast two different types of security, proactive and traditional. And traditional is the type of security you're possibly familiar with. For example, running a firewall, antivirus software. Most of us have used that before. Maybe on a slightly more advanced level, something like intrusion detection system or intrusion protection prevention system. Now, the problem with these is that they're very reactive. So, for example, when do you need a firewall? You need a firewall when someone is already trying to penetrate your network. The attack has already begun. Or antivirus, when is that useful? It's useful when you already have a virus in your system. And same for IDS and IPS, they're very reactive. And we could say the same for retrospective analysis. That's looking at what went wrong. For example, your entire corporation has been taken down by a ransomware attack and you're out of business. Let's take a moment and think about what went wrong. Now, that's all very well and useful. You can definitely learn some lessons for that, but wouldn't it be better if that attack was prevented in the first place? And this is where proactive security comes into play. So there's some examples of what constitutes proactive security there. Penetration testing. So this is a rigorous, systematic testing of a specific asset. Threat hunting. The best way to describe threat hunting is you assume that your network or your company has already been compromised, and you look for indicators of compromise and attempt to remove them. Threat intelligence, that's something that makes use or is coupled with threat feeds. Now, a threat feed is a vendor that provides all of the latest information in terms of what types of attack are currently taking place. And armed with that knowledge, you're able to protect against the most current threats before they even have an opportunity to take place. So this is why we need more humans in the cybersecurity industry for this proactive security. Now, many of you here are probably thinking about getting into the cybersecurity industry as a career, and I've made a list of prerequisites. Now, these are optional. You don't have to meet everything on this list. Think of it as a checklist, and the more of these boxes that you can check, the more you will find it easy to integrate into a career in cybersecurity. Now, if you look at the list and think, well, actually, I don't do any of those on the list, that's completely fine. It doesn't mean that you can't enjoy a career in cybersecurity, but think of it as a bonus if you have the ability to do some of the following. IT fundamentals. So, for example, can you use Windows? Great. Can you use Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Android, and other operating systems? Even better. Networking. We often find if someone already has a career in networking that it's a very good fit for them to migrate over to a career in cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is deeply entwined with networking, difficult to separate them. Any pre-existing cybersecurity skills, even if it's just using antivirus or using a firewall, that can be handy. Coding. Now, you saw in the video, it did mention that you don't actually need to know coding. And it's true, you don't need to know coding in order to enter into a career in the cybersecurity industry. But my personal recommendation, and from my own personal experience, coding is one of the best things that you can do if you want to have a lot of value in the cybersecurity industry. It does depend a little bit on your career path. Some career paths may value coding more than others. We'll get to that a bit shortly. And I would say just generally, if you enjoy using computers or you enjoy other types of technical domain. Now, what do I mean by technical domain? I mean, for example, if you have a degree in maths or physics or engineering, these are all kinds of topics that are going to lend themselves nicely. It's very likely you would enjoy a career in cybersecurity. And I would just generally say acquisition of knowledge. If you enjoy reading, you will enjoy cybersecurity. If you don't enjoy reading, it's going to be a little bit harder to integrate, although it doesn't mean that it's impossible. Now, if you take a look at the main EC Council webpage, you'll see that cybersecurity is broken down into different career paths. So there are 5 career paths listed, and this is not an exhaustive list, and there is crossover between some of the career paths. But here are the career paths listed on the main page. We have penetration testing, network defense, forensics, incident handling and response, application security. So the objective here today is just to give you a high-level overview of the different career paths, what's involved in them. So let's start with penetration testing. Now, what is penetration testing? We mentioned it at the outset. In fact, it's a rigorous systematic testing of an asset. Now, that asset could be an online asset, such as a web page, for example, or it could be a physical asset. For example, it could be a bank or some other type of building. Now, anytime penetration testing takes place, it's with the permission of the security governance program of that specific asset. So we have permission to test. As a general rule, you shouldn't really be testing anything without permission in the cybersecurity industry. So the idea is once we've performed a test as a penetration tester, we then file a report with whoever has commissioned that particular test. The difference between online testing is it's obviously technical to do with computers, whereas physical penetration testing, it does have some need to have ability with computers and hacking, but there's also ability with physical security controls. For example, things like picking locks or how to bypass different types of physical security control is very valuable for this particular job. Also, social engineering as well. Can you convince someone to let you into a certain part of the building? Perhaps you're pretending to be part of the maintenance team, for example. Can you convince someone to let you into somewhere where you shouldn't be so that you can steal data? And again, this is all above board. The idea is you report your findings back to perhaps the Chief Information Security Officer. Now, penetration testing is an example of offensive cybersecurity. So we're defending by attacking and looking for vulnerabilities. But there are also more defensive career paths. So this falls under the category of network defense. Now, when we think about a security governance program in a corporation, for example, we often think of CISO. So this stands for Chief Information Security Officer. So this is the guy at the top of the security chain. He's in charge of all of the different aspects of security for a specific company. But underneath that, there are many other roles that are related to network defense. For example, network security engineer designs, implements, and maintains security measures. Security administrator manages an organization's security policies and procedures. Cybersecurity analyst monitors network for breaches, investigates violations, and compliance officer ensures organization adheres to regulatory requirements. And there are quite a few of these. It's a whole branch of cybersecurity in itself. Just to give you a couple of examples, you've got PCI DSS, that's to do with payment provider information and how that's handled, payment details, credit card information, and HIPAA, that's to do with the way that medical records are handled. And there are strict rules with how these need to be handled. Otherwise, companies can face fines and legal actions. So this is going to be under the domain of a compliance officer. Moving on to forensics. Now, you're familiar with the idea, if there was a crime scene, if there was a murder scene, then one of the first groups of people to show up to that scene are going to be forensics investigators. And what they're looking for is they're looking for evidence. They're looking for fingerprints. They're looking for DNA. They're looking for a murder weapon, potentially. The idea is they use that to build a case and then to prosecute the criminal that's involved. Now, when we take a look at a digital crime that's taken place involving computers, the process is no different. There is a team of forensics that show up, digital forensic in this case. They gather and preserve evidence. So instead of fingerprints and DNA, the evidence is now computer systems. It could be hard drives, could be routers, network equipment, printers. The idea is they gather, preserve the evidence. They have a couple of goals. One of them is to protect the organization. And the second, perhaps most important role in forensics is to support the prosecution of the perpetrator. I always think of forensics as being quite a high pressure job, because if you imagine that you show up at a digital crime scene for the first time, you have to act quickly and decisively in that situation. To give you a simple example, you see that a computer has been used potentially as part of a crime. It's possible that the hacker, the criminal hacker, still has access to that system somehow and is currently in the process of initiating a remote wipe of all of the data on the hard drive. You don't act quickly, that crucial evidence is going to be gone. Another example is the importance of dealing carefully with volatile memory. Now, what is volatile memory? We're familiar that a computer has something like a hard drive, for example. Now, when you switch your computer off, all of the information on the hard drive is still there. When you turn your computer on again, the information is still there. Volatile memory, it's not the case. Volatile memory disappears as soon as you switch off your system. Example of volatile memory is anything that's stored in RAM on your system. As soon as you switch off that system, the RAM's gone. But that volatile memory could contain important information that helps you to build a case against the perpetrator. So an important step is making sure that that volatile memory is retrieved and backed up before a system is turned off. The final thing there is that evidence must be admissible. So imagine, for example, there's a laptop and it's got all of the information you need to put a criminal hacker away in jail for a long period of time. But during the process, that laptop just goes missing for a few weeks. No one knows where it is. And then it shows up again at the end of those 3 weeks. And then it's provided as evidence in court. Well, unfortunately, the bad news is that laptop can no longer be used as evidence. Despite having all of the information you need to prosecute, that laptop cannot be used because who knows where it was those missing 3 weeks. And during that time, the evidence could have been tampered with. Someone could have planted evidence on that device. That evidence is no longer admissible. So in order for evidence to be admissible, it needs to be treated in a very specific way by the forensic investigator. And there needs to be what's known as a chain of custody document that keeps track of where that piece of evidence has been ever since it was documented at the crime scene. So very, very serious, high pressure job, but it might be something that you think sounds exciting, you'd like to get into. Incident handling and response. So if you take a large organization, they will have a team that responds specifically to security incidents. In fact, that's their only job in a big organization, respond to security incidents. And part of their objective is to maintain business continuity. In other words, the business needs to keep its operations up, otherwise it's going to lose profits. And assuming those operations have been halted by the security incident, then part of the incident handling and response team is going to be to restore that business continuity as soon as possible. Now, as part of the incident handling and response, at some point, the forensics team will be called. So you can see there's a bit of crossover between these two career paths because part of incident handling and response is making sure that the forensics team is called in at the appropriate time. Part of the incident handling and response process will also be to retrospectively evaluate how can we improve the security going forward and how can we improve the quality of our incident response going forward. Now, there are some other related but technically slightly different career paths that all fall under this umbrella. So we have risk management. That's taking a look at the types of risks that an organization are taking on a daily basis. All organizations have risks, but the goal of risk management is to decide which risks can be tolerated and which types of risks need to be mitigated. Disaster recovery, another career path. In some ways, it's quite similar to incident handling and response, but the key difference is disaster recovery usually is referencing a disaster in the environment. So it could be some kind of flood, some kind of physical damage has occurred to operations, and it's necessary to maintain business continuity in that aspect as well. So disaster recovery is usually focusing on a physical incident rather than a hacking attack, although there could be some crossover there. You'll also see SOC mentioned, and this, in a sense, is its own career path as well. So SOC stands for Security Operations Center. Probably seen this in the movies. Imagine a room, it's just full of rows of monitors and desks, and then perhaps at the front there are giant monitors, and security operations take place there. Incident handling and response is also handled in security operations centers. So places like banks or payment providers may have security operations center, or a nation state actor may have a security operations center. They handle incident handling and response there, but they also do other stuff in an SOC. For example, just general cybersecurity analysis is performed there on a regular basis. Application security, so that was our last career path. So this is securing applications, including web applications, including software. And this is where bounty hunting comes in that I mentioned at the outset. So bounty hunting really falls under application security. Bounty hunting, it's fairly similar to penetration testing, although the end objective is not necessarily a rigorous systematic testing of a specific asset. Really, the goal of a bounty hunter is simply to find one crucial bug in an application that can then be disclosed in exchange for a bounty or a monetary payout for finding that specific bug. That's why it's called bounty hunting. And it's an example of a career path that you can do as a freelancer. You don't need to be employed to be a bounty hunter. Now, also, if you think about the way that software is designed as well, so the typical way that a developer might build a software is they'll decide about all of the features they want included in that software. They'll build an amazing piece of software. And then at the end of it, they'll say to themselves, well, okay, I've built this amazing app. Now I need to start thinking about securing that app. But really, the whole process is backwards. If we wait until an app is complete before we add a layer of security, it's already too late. In fact, that security should have been baked into the coding of the app right from the beginning. In fact, before we even wrote the first line of code, there should have been time spent thinking about the possible attacks that may occur against this application and which types of features are needed in order to make sure the app's secure. In fact, this is a process known as threat modeling, thinking about the different ways that a bad actor may try and attack our software and perhaps siphon out important information that really should be secure. So application security, it's important from a coding perspective as well. Now let's think about an example of web application security. We're going to think about the types of assets now that we need to protect. We've talked about some of the career paths. We're going to talk about the types of assets that need protecting. Now we mentioned bug bounty, which very often revolves around finding bugs in web apps. And here's an example, should just give you a flavor of the type of bug you might find. Now this particular vulnerability, it's very, very straightforward. It potentially wouldn't work in a real world environment, but it gives you an idea of what kind of things that hackers are looking for. And obviously you should never try this without permission to test a specific web app. So this is a type of vulnerability that's known as HTTP parameter pollution. Now what you can see here is a simplified output of an account in the browser. So you can see it says the information for user 234. So it's showing the account information for a user with the ID 234. And if you take a look at the URL bar there, we have example.com/account. We then have a question mark. And in a URL, the question mark indicates the beginning of a query string. And the query string is a set of key value pairs that's sent to the backend that's then processed by the web app itself. So here in this case, we can see the key value pair, user ID equals 234. And then we have user 234 information loaded. So the question is, what would happen if we were to change directly in the URL as part of the query string and set user ID equals 235 instead? What would happen? Now, what should happen is that every logged in user has a unique session ID. And if we try and access user 235's account, the web app's going to look at that session ID and say, hold on, you're not user 235 because user 235 does not have that session ID. Then we might get a page not found 404 response, for example, or a forbidden response from the backend. But imagine that the web app has not been coded securely. What might happen? The web app might just ascertain that we're logged in as user 234 and then show us the account information for user 235. All of a sudden, we've compromised the account of another user. If you were doing this as part of a bug bounty program, you'd be entitled to a payout in this case because you found a bug. Here's another example. This is a type of attack referred to as cross-site scripting. It's very, very common in the world of web application security. Let's imagine you have a web page with a search box, and you can see at the moment we've typed in the search phrase, hello world, we've clicked search, and now reflected back to us on the page, we get our search term, your search term, hello world. So we can see that our input is eventually ending up as part of the HTML on that page. So here's what a hacker may try and do is try and inject HTML directly as a search term. So we have script tags, and in HTML, JavaScript exists between script tags. And then we have the alert function called with the string XSS passed as the alert function. Now, if you're very, very sharp, you'll know that the XSS is supposed to have single or double quotes because this is not a valid string at the moment. But let's just pretend that the XSS has single quotes surrounding it. Now, what happens is we get your search term, but we don't get anything passed back to us or reflected back to us because our search term is now actually injected as part of the HTML on the page, which means we're now running JavaScript. And the end result of this is you will get a pop-up box. This is part of the JavaScript alert method. It pops up a box to the page with the string XSS. Now, the implication of this is that we have the ability to run JavaScript, arbitrary JavaScript, in a victim's browser, which means we can do things like steal session information and other data that really should be secure. This is an example of web application security gone wrong. But it's not just web apps. There are many other types of assets that need to be protected, and this is why there's a shortfall in the cybersecurity industry. It's estimated that over 120 new devices connect to the internet every second. I mean, when you think about that, that's completely mind-boggling, isn't it? 120 new devices connected to the internet every second. And what are the chances that at least a few of those 120 devices have serious vulnerabilities in them, which make them a target for hackers? I would say it's almost a certainty that there are quite a number of vulnerable devices connecting to the internet every second. But like we mentioned, it's not just web apps, it's also IoT devices. This is really referring to smart devices. So if you have a toaster or a fridge that connects to the internet, that's an example of an IoT device. OT, we're often familiar with IT, information technology, but OT is operational technology. This is to do with industrial control systems. Also, wireless security, wireless signals are a target, and also cloud security is very, very important and presents a target for hackers. It's being used more and more in the modern environment. So let's think about why security is so important for these other types of asset and what kind of things can go wrong if these devices are not secured. So here's some examples of somewhat recent hacks that have occurred with IoT devices. So starting back in 2012, TrendNet security cameras, they had a password bypass. In other words, if I had a security camera, you would be able to access my video feed and bypass the need to use a password to do that. So you could see my video feed as a hacker. The end result of that is a large amount of private videos were leaked online. They'd been stolen from these TrendNet security cameras by hackers. 2015, we saw a Jeep hack. 1.4 million vehicles required a physical product recall. So security researchers demonstrated it was possible to access certain controls in the Jeep remotely, including the ability to potentially bring a Jeep to a complete stop on the highway or the motorway. As you can imagine, that's something that could result in a fatality. That's a serious vulnerability. 2017, St. Jude hackable cardiac devices. So think about something like a pacemaker. This is an IoT device that is keeping you alive, and now hackers have the ability to remotely access that and play around with the settings. Hackers could actually cause loss of life when these types of devices are not secured. Let's think about OT, operational technology. This is technology used for industrial control systems. So think things like power plants, water cleaning systems, oil refineries. These all use technology. It's a slightly different flavor of technology than IT, but often the two are mixed together in a certain relationship. To give an example of OT security gone wrong, May 2021, Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So this Colonial Pipeline was a giant pipeline in the US that stretched thousands of kilometers and delivered fuel across the country. Unfortunately, hackers were able to compromise the particular pipeline. They were able to install ransomware, essentially holding the pipeline hostage. It wasn't delivering fuel. So there's two problems that are caused by this. The first is that ultimately 4.4 million US dollars are paid to the hacker group DarkSide, although apparently some of that was recovered. But more than that, when the general public found out that there was a problem with the pipeline being hacked, everyone starts panicking. Everyone's rushing to get fuel for fear of a fuel shortage. You may have seen such things during the pandemic, for example, people doing stupid things like filling carrier bags with petrol, for example, hoping to stock up because they know there's a shortage. So in some senses, the panic buying actually causes more problem than the hackers did in this case. Wireless security. Let's take a look at an example that's actually featured in the CCT course. This is something that's referred to as the rolling code attack, and it really gives you a flavor of how hackers think about compromising certain systems. So you're probably familiar with the idea that it's possible to unlock a vehicle with a key fob using a wireless signal. Now, this is called a rolling code attack because that vehicle will only take the same code once. You try and resubmit the same code again, it won't accept it, it won't unlock. So here's how the rolling code attack works. The victim presses the button on their key, hoping to unlock the vehicle. The hacker collects that code while simultaneously jamming the signal so that it doesn't reach the vehicle. The hacker now has code number 1 stored on his device. The victim's car doesn't unlock, so he presses the button a second time, sends a second code. Once again, the hacker catches that code and simultaneously jams the signal from the key fob so it doesn't reach the vehicle. Then the hacker forwards the first code that it's captured, unlocking the vehicle. The victim doesn't know any of this is taking place and assumes that his vehicle just unlocked the second time, but it didn't work the first time. Problem here, hacker now has the second code on his device. He's able to return at a later date, unlock, and steal the vehicle. Think about cloud security. Now, to give you one example of a vulnerability, cloud security is vulnerable to what we can refer to as a side channel attack. Now, side channel attacks are very, very interesting. We can barely scratch the surface in this webinar, but to give you an example of a side channel attack, imagine you had a CD-ROM. Now, I assume most of you are familiar with CD-ROM, something that you could place inside of your PC, certainly older desktop computers. And you probably remember they used to make that sound. When it was reading a disk, it used to make a sound. Now, technically, while to the average person that sound is just a sound of the disk being read, that sound actually conveys information regarding the contents of the CD-ROM that's being placed in the drive. And if we're able to enumerate some of the information on that disk based on the sound that's made by the CD-ROM drive, that's an example of a side channel attack. So how does this apply to cloud security? Well, side channel attack leverages shared resources on a physical server. So when we think about a cloud server, although it's a virtualized server, all of them exist on a physical server somewhere. There has to be some physical hardware because these servers aren't actually in a cloud somewhere, they're on a physical server. So you may be given a virtual server that's on the same physical device as someone else's virtual server. And although they are logically separated, they're sharing certain resources. For example, they're sharing CPU access, they're sharing memory potentially. As a result, it's sometimes possible to extract information from a device that's stored on the same physical, or a server, virtual server that's stored on the same physical device as your own. It's referred to as a side channel attack in cloud security. One final example is blockchain. We hear a lot about Web3 and how it's going to ultimately replace Web2. Thinking about blockchain, we're thinking about dApps, for example. Potentially the largest ever crypto hack was the Ronin network attack. This was a side chain to the Ethereum chain, and it powered a gaming marketplace for NFT-driven game Axie Infinity. The end result of this hack, 173,600 Ether and 25.5 million in USDC stolen, approximately 625 million in stolen funds. So we can see the size of some of these potential hacks when it comes to blockchain. Absolutely massive. Ultimately, this attack was attributed to the North Korean hackers by FBI, hacker collective known as the Lazarus Group. Although attribution is a tricky thing, it's very difficult to concretely prove that certain actors were responsible for a specific hack. Okay, so if any of the things that you've heard today sound interesting, I haven't lost you, you're still here and you're still interested in a career in cybersecurity, how exactly can you get started? Now, here's a screenshot from the list of certifications on the EC Council site. And as you can see, there's quite a few of them there. And you wouldn't ordinarily do all of the certs. I mean, you can if you want to, but you would normally plot a specific career path through these certifications, depending on what you want to do. We've already discussed some of the different career paths that you can take. Now, to help us with that, EC Council provides a roadmap through those certifications. So to give an example, if you focus on the center of the presentation here, you'll see where it says penetration testing, and it plots a path for that career path through the certs for penetration testing. So you start with network defense essentials, ethical hacking essentials, digital forensic essentials. By the way, these essential courses, my understanding of it is that you can actually do these certs for free with a Code Red account, which is also free. That's my understanding of this. You then move on to the CCT, and that's something that is available at heavily reduced price as a result of the scholarships that EC Council are offering. You then move on to Certified Network Defender, Certified Ethical Hacker. Then at that stage, you specialize. So you say, okay, I want to get into penetration testing. So then you do web application hacking and security and penetration testing. Now, if you're interested in one of the other parts, for example, you decide that you wanted to do something like forensics, for example, the first certs are the same for each path. So you start with the essentials, then the CCT, then the core certified network defender and certified ethical hacker. So you don't necessarily need to choose how you're going to specialize just yet. You can decide that on the process as you get started, as you explore all of the different domains of cybersecurity, you can decide what your preference is. But either way, the certs all start with the same path, and then you specialize depending on what it is that you want to do. So let's talk briefly about getting started. Aside from the EC Council certs, which are a great place to start, especially the essential certs that we looked at, which I think you can do those for free. Vulnerable web apps and CTF games. So these are applications that are designed to be hacked for training purposes. They can be very useful. Learning to write code and develop apps. Saw in the video that you don't have to write code. If you really don't want to learn code, you can still find a job in the cybersecurity industry. But my personal recommendation is learn to write code at the same time as you learn cybersecurity. It's going to be hugely beneficial for you. Learning general networking concepts. And as mentioned, you can get started with the EC Council certs, either with the essential certs, or now is a great time to apply also for the CCT scholarship as well, if you want to take the CCT exam at a reduced cost. Well, that's pretty much it. Just want to say thanks very much for your attention. There will be some time for Q&A a little bit later. For now, I'm just going to hand back to the EC Council team.
Thank you very much, Adam, for delivering such an insightful and informative session. We found the webinar very engaging and hope it was valuable for you as well. Before we begin with the Q&A, I would like to inform all the attendees that the session is in sync with EC Council CCT program. CCT is an entry-level certification program by EC Council. This program provides multi-domain technical skills, 85 hands-on labs, has captured the flag exercises and performance-based exam delivered on a live cyber range. There are going to be 3.5 million cybersecurity job vacancies in the world by 2025. As a commitment to close the cybersecurity workforce gap by creating multi-domain cyber technician, EC Council has pledged $7 million towards CCT education and certification scholarships to certify approximately 20,000 cyber professionals ready to contribute to the industry. If you are interested to know more, kindly participate in the poll that will be conducted now. So, Adam, should we proceed with question and answer?
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Okay. So our first question is, with the rise of ransomware and data breaches, should SMBs reevaluate the requirements for entry-level cybersecurity positions? Example, bachelor's degree and 10 years of experience.
Yeah, I think the problem here is there's obviously a shortage of cybersecurity professionals in the industry. So it puts businesses in a difficult position where realistically they either need to lower the requirements for entry, or they're going to risk not necessarily having workers in the field. But the problem is then when you lower the requirements too much, you're going to find that your workers can't necessarily meet the demands for the type of activities that threat actors and hackers are participating in. So I'm not sure whether you're asking whether they should increase them, because assuming increase is difficult as well, because there's already a shortage of workers. So making it harder for people to find jobs in the cybersecurity industry is not really going to help. It's definitely a very delicate balance where the real solution to anything is not necessarily to change the entry requirements. It's really to bring more people into the industry and make sure that they have proper training to meet the needs where there's a gap in the industry in this case. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's important as well that one of the problems we have is when companies don't necessarily value those people who work in the cybersecurity industry, they do things like offer salaries that don't really make sense for the specific job role. So I think if anything, salaries should be increased. Maybe not so much in the US. If those statistics we looked at earlier can be trusted, then clearly US are doing a very good job of paying cybersecurity professionals well. That's not necessarily the case everywhere you go on the earth. So I think really the solutions here are not to do with entry requirements, is to do with correct pay for employees and appreciation for the importance of cybersecurity professionals, and also just bringing more people into the industry with the correct level of training to be able to perform the task specifically. So I think those are really the solutions rather than adjusting the entry requirement itself.
Thank you for answering that question. We'll move towards our next question, which is, as a beginner, could you please recommend us some books for starting off with networking basics?
It's hard to think of something specific. I know there's a book by O'Reilly Publishers that just talk about the absolute basics of networking, and it even really goes into low-level stuff that you don't necessarily even learn on a networking course. You know, for example, how to fix an RJ45 cable that's been broken, and it really goes down into what we can refer to as layer one as well. So things like digital signals and how they're encoded over the network. And I think if you really break things down that way, you're going to have a full understanding, because otherwise what can happen with some resources is you kind of jump in at a fairly advanced level of networking, and it can be very, very difficult to wrap your head around specific networking concepts unless you have a good idea of the basics of how networking actually works. So I know O'Reilly Publishers does have a book on the basics of networking, but that's just one that I've read personally. I can think at the top of my head. There are plenty of other resources. I actually kind of started more in the ethical hacking. So there was a book, I forget the exact name. It was to do with, I think it's Web Hacking 101 or something. It was to do with penetration testing. And that's the book where I looked into that, and I realized that, hey, a lot of these hacks actually are to do with coding. And that's when I realized that actually if I wanted to do this properly, I'd have to learn to code as well. But yeah, check out, see if you can find that book that I'm referring to. But if not, there are plenty of books on learning basic networking out there as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Adam. We'll move to our next question, which is, what are the essential tools and resources beginners can use to enhance their cybersecurity posture?
All right, yeah, good question. And I think certainly some of the certs that we've looked at today, which as mentioned, they seem to be free of charge. That's my understanding of them. The only thing you need to do is sign up for a Code Red account. So Code Red, it's a training platform that's affiliated with EC Council. In fact, I think it is EC Council that operates Code Red. And it's there that you can find the videos for all of those essential courses that talk about things like network defense, for example. So network defense essentials. That's a really great place to start. Just check out those essentials. In other words, before you even need to do a paid cert, which is definitely recommended at some point, there are a decent amount of free resources, including those that you can find on the EC Council site as well, which are going to teach you how to improve your cybersecurity posture at a good level.
Thank you for answering that. We'll just piece of information, Code Red can also be found with the name of EC Council Learning. This is for our audience. You can go on EC Council page and search for EC Council Learning, and you will get what Adam is talking about. Okay, so we'll move to our next question, which is, to get started, should I first begin with fundamentals or take a certification oriented approach?
Okay, yeah, very good question. So basically, they are one and the same thing, really. If you start with certification-oriented approach, as you saw in those career paths, many of these career paths are actually designed to teach you the fundamentals. And what will happen is if you start one of the certs, and let's say you're reading through the courseware in one of the certs, and you realize that you don't really understand a certain fundamental concept, and you don't feel that you can understand it based on what's included in the courseware, then you have the ability to branch out and spend a bit of extra time researching the fundamentals. Because you see, the issue that we get is that there are so many fundamentals in the cybersecurity domain. You could spend your entire life just studying fundamentals of different parts of cybersecurity. So really what the courseware does is it gives you a roadmap for understanding which topics are going to show up at the highest frequency, what is going to be the most important area of focus as a cybersecurity professional. So you can absolutely just do both at once, where you say, okay, I'm going to tackle this particular entry-level cert, and as I go, I'm going to fill in the blanks on any fundamental information that I feel is lacking. But as mentioned, these courses are designed to be fundamental certs. In other words, the objective is to teach you the basics. So you don't need to feel like you have to have a bunch of prerequisites before you jump in to taking an entry-level cert.
Thank you for answering that, Adam. We'll move to our next question, which is, what is your take on CEH Master and CCT as a career path in cybersec exclusive of pen testing?
So as we saw in those career paths earlier, the CEH and the CCT were basically included in all of the career paths. In other words, whatever you want to do, it's probably a good idea to do the CCT and the CEH. But then also what we saw in those career paths is that if you are specifically looking to focus on something like penetration testing, there are some other certs that give you some extra tools for those specific jobs. So we can see that EC Council has specific cert on pen testing, and they also have a specific cert on web application hacking. In other words, yeah, it's a great path, but it's also a great path for everything. Like whatever you want to get into, CCT then CEH is going to be a great path. But then when we saw from the EC Council roadmaps, after that, there's probably some additional certs that will help you to specialize on that specific area of penetration testing.
Thank you for answering that. We'll take another question, which is, which certificate program should we do for an entry-level cybersecurity job?
All right, yeah, good question. So you probably realized by now that a lot of this particular webinar was based around CCT cert, which is the Certified Cybersecurity Technician. That's really going to be a great qualification for an entry-level job. Now, depending on whether you should jump straight into that, will be based around your current level of knowledge. So although it is an entry-level cert, there are still some prerequisites. In other words, if you know absolutely nothing about computers, there could be some fundamentals that you need to brush up on first. Maybe some of the essential certs that we discussed will help you with that. But generally, if you are reasonably proficient with using computers and you already have a little bit of knowledge about networking, a little bit of knowledge about hacking, then you can jump straight into the CCT. You'll be able to fill in the blanks as you go. So if there's something that you don't know, you can just spend a bit of extra time researching that when you get to that point on the CCT cert. So don't feel you need any prerequisites. If you're just interested in an entry-level job, that is pretty much what the CCT is designed for, to give you a very high-level overview of everything to do with cybersecurity. And plus, as we mentioned, it's something that you can get at a sizable discount right now due to the fact that it's being offered as part of a scholarship program, which, we don't know if that will persist indefinitely. I mean, I certainly don't know. So that's something that might be good to jump on straight away, is to have a look, see if you can do the CCT program at a discounted rate. That's good enough for an entry-level job for sure.
Thank you for answering that. We'll take last two questions, which is, what is your opinion about pen testing a web application with AI, like a chatbot with GPT-4 integration, in the pre-launch testing phase with OWASP, Z, and fuzziness of first testing?
Let me just reread that. What is your opinion about pen testing a web application with AI? So we're talking about a web app. And we do know that OWASP Z-Attack proxy is specifically for proxying web traffic most of the time. I mean, I don't have any specific opinion on that. What I would say is, as much as possible, we want these kind of tests to be based on what we've researched. In other words, there should be a recon phase where we're actually thinking about which types of attack vectors are likely to work. One of the worst things that you can do is simply point a tool at it. I know, for example, that Z Attack Proxy has some kind of automated scanner built in where you can see different types of vulnerability along with their severity. But realistically, it's just point and click. It's not necessarily going to reveal vulnerabilities in the underlying web app. It's just going to give you warnings and things like that. So the best thing I can recommend is not just to use these tools blindly, but really get a feel for the logic of how this particular app works, what its points of ingress are in terms of where do you get points to potentially inject into the application. And based on the way that the logic of that app works, think about how it could potentially be broken. That way, when you do use something like a fuzzer, for example, you can pick your payloads very carefully, in a very targeted way that's likely to damage the underlying logic behind that web app. And like we mentioned as well before, this wasn't mentioned in your question, but obviously make sure that you actually have permission to test this. This means it should be part of some kind of bug bounty program, for example. It shouldn't just be a web app that you feel like seeing if you can break, because obviously this kind of activity is illegal.
Thank you for answering that. We will take last question of the day, which is, what's been your experience with CCT certification? Would you recommend it for starting a career in cybersecurity?
Yeah, CCT is definitely recommended. Like I mentioned earlier, it's definitely a bonus if you like reading. The courseware is very long, very, very extensive. So if you like reading a lot, it's good. But also along with the CCT, there's video courses as well. And there's also live labs. So live labs demonstrate concepts. For example, in the CCT, there are lab exercises on setting up a firewall, intrusion prevention system, intrusion detection system, stuff like that. There's also labs that teach you ethical hacking and different types of information security attack. You also go into some of the other areas as well that we mentioned in today's session, like operational technology, cloud security, Internet of Things security. So it really, really does give you a very broad overview of the cybersecurity industry. Like we mentioned, there's the videos, there's the labs, and there's also the course guidelines, all of which are included in the CCT cert. So yeah, definitely highly recommended place to start for an entry-level cybersecurity job.
Thank you for answering that. Great to hear your experience with our CCT course. Thank you so much to our wonderful speaker, Adam, for answering all those questions and for a great presentation and the knowledge shared with our global audience. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we are looking for more and more sessions with you, Adam. Before we conclude the webinar, Adam, would you like to give a message to our audience?
There's no specific message, but I just want to say thanks very much for your attention today, and hope you found it interesting, and I hope you managed to find a career in cybersecurity.
Thank you so much, Adam.